It started the way most betrayals do, not with fire, not with screaming or door slams or lipstick stains on collar tips, but with silence, a growing and undetectable silence, like a crack in the foundation that widens day by day without a sound, until suddenly one morning the house collapses on top of you while you're sipping your coffee and wondering why it tastes a little more bitter than usual. And Daniel should have known, he should have felt it coming. But like so many men too focused on the next milestone, the next meeting, the next shot at the quarterly bonus, he missed the quiet warning signs that Laura, his wife of 6 years, had begun to drift sideways into a world he wasn't invited to enter. A world with candles and wine, laughter and lowered voices behind closed doors. And more importantly, it was a world that included a man named Christopher Langdon, Vice President of Strategic Growth at Barclay and Hume. The same man who hired Daniel 3 years ago with a firm handshake and a charming smile that showed too many teeth, the kind of smile that looks like success, like secrets, like power. And Daniel had respected him, perhaps even admired him, never imagining that his mentor, his superior, the man who called him kid in meetings but trusted him with million-dollar accounts, was quietly seducing his wife over 2 months of after-hours chats disguised as casual drinks. Meetings that Daniel dismissed because, networking's important, babe. And, if you can get us in good with someone like Chris, that's gold, he said that once to Laura. Not knowing those words would become prophecy. A bitter, twisting kind of prophecy that would unfold not in a dramatic explosion but through an oddly timed promotion email sent on a Monday morning. Subject line: "Congratulations on your promotion, effective immediately," which should have been a triumph but felt hollow, sour, like biting into fruit that looked perfect but was rotting inside. And he hadn't even applied for the job, hadn't even considered himself ready, but there it was. Senior Client Director, same floor but a corner office, a raise big enough to double their mortgage payments. And the strangest part was Laura's reaction. Because when he told her that night over dinner, she didn't squeal or jump up and down like she used to. She just smiled faintly and said, "I knew something good would happen," then took a sip of her wine, looking past him, out the window, like she wasn't surprised at all. And maybe that's when the pieces started to shift in his head, pieces he didn't want to look at too closely yet. But they were there, nagging, buzzing, the way she'd been distant lately, the way her phone was always face down on the table, the way she suddenly had new dresses she didn't wear for him, the way her scent changed. New perfume, deeper, more musky, and he had dismissed it all until that moment, that smile, that knowing smile, and still he said nothing, not for days, not even when he walked into Chris Langdon's office that Thursday to thank him. And found the man leaning back in his chair, grinning, saying, "Well deserved, Dan. You're sharper than you know." And there was something too familiar in the way he said Dan, something oily in his tone, like he owned something Daniel hadn't realized he'd wagered. And it wasn't until weeks later, during the annual company retreat at the lakeside villa upstate, when Daniel saw Laura, who hadn't planned to attend but showed up last minute to surprise him, slip out onto the back deck at midnight with Chris, laughing softly in the moonlight, and stay gone for 45 minutes. Long enough for Daniel to feel the cold enter his bones, long enough for the confirmation to sink in like poison. She was sleeping with his boss, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't confront her that night, didn't even flinch when she climbed back into bed smelling faintly of aftershave that wasn't his. Instead he lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking not just of the betrayal but the strategy behind it. The implications, the strange math of how infidelity had equaled upward mobility, and something darker stirred in him, something unfamiliar, because in that moment he realized she had played the game, and won, and that maybe he was now holding a different kind of power. Because what do you do when your wife is sleeping with your boss and your reward is a raise, a title, and access to rooms you were never meant to enter? You start watching. That's what you do, not reacting, not confronting, but watching like a hawk circling a battlefield. Because knowledge is leverage and leverage is currency in this new world he found himself unwillingly promoted into. And so Daniel began cataloging everything. Times, glances, schedules, changes in tone, receipts in her purse from places they never went together, flights of red wine when she always claimed to prefer white. And he smiled through it all, kissed her cheek in the mornings, packed her car with the gym bag he knew she never opened, and then he began smiling at Chris too, meeting his gaze just a little longer in the elevator, bringing coffee to his office with just the right amount of cream, the way Chris liked it. A power play masked as friendliness, because now he was playing too, and it felt dangerous and strange, like pretending to be asleep while a wolf circled your bed. But instead of fear there was a thrill, a kind of cold thrill that replaced the hurt. And one day, in a moment of mad clarity, Daniel thought, What if I let this go further? What if I feed the fire instead of trying to put it out? And it wasn't forgiveness, no, it was something darker, an experiment, because if Laura was willing to do this for his career, what else might she unlock? What doors could open if he pushed it, encouraged it? And the next time she came home late, he didn't ask, he offered her a glass of wine and said he hoped she'd made a good impression, and her eyes flicked to his with something between suspicion and shame, but he kept his tone light, his posture loose, and over the following weeks he became what he never imagined. An accomplice to his own betrayal, nodding along as she made excuses, telling her how important it was to stay in good with Chris. And then one evening she brought home a watch, a sleek, black Omega that shimmered like ink, and said, "Chris thought it would suit you better than him." And Daniel just smiled and slid it onto his wrist without a word, because he knew the price had already been paid in a hotel room somewhere across town. And as the watch ticked quietly on his wrist, it sounded less like betrayal and more like the beginning of a countdown to something far more dangerous. Because once you accept that love is a currency and people are investments, there's no going back to who you were before, and Daniel did not go back, no, he stepped deeper into it, slowly and methodically feeding the narrative like a novelist building toward a climax, allowing Chris to believe his dominance remained hidden, encouraging Laura's absences with soft, supportive words, planting the idea of Chris's mentorship at parties, turning his colleagues' heads with tales of how the VP had taken a special interest in Daniel's potential, and soon enough, rumors began to swirl, whispers in the break room, sidelong glances in the hall, questions posed with mock innocence, until finally the quiet architecture of Daniel's revenge was fully built, a palace of mirrors where every reflection distorted the truth just enough to become dangerous. And then when the time was right, Daniel walked into HR with a flash drive, a timeline, and a carefully rehearsed tone of confusion and concern, not accusation, not yet, just concern. And the investigation that followed was clinical, discreet, thorough, and by the time Chris Langdon realized the walls were closing in, the board had already seen the emails, the private dinners logged on company cards, the messages to Laura that included language no executive should send to an employee's wife, and Daniel, ever the loyal subordinate, stood with furrowed brow and solemn nods as they asked if he felt pressured, compromised, manipulated, and he said yes. Yes, he had been manipulated, yes, he'd been taken advantage of, and when Chris was fired quietly under the pretense of a strategic restructure, Daniel was promoted again, this time with a title that came with a car, an assistant, and a view of the skyline, and Laura stood beside him at the celebratory dinner in a black dress he'd picked for her, smiled at the camera when the flashbulbs popped, and whispered to him later in bed, "You deserve all of this," and he nodded, kissing her shoulder already, calculating what the next chapter would require, because he had learned the rules of this world now, and there was no going back to the man who once sipped bitter coffee and believed in clean lines between love and ambition. There was only forward, only deeper, only power. But power, as Daniel quickly learned, is a drug that dulls its own edge. You don't realize how hooked you've become until you find yourself inventing reasons to flex it. A raise becomes expected, not thrilling. A favor returned feels like an obligation owed. And Laura, once the centerpiece of his quiet agony, the catalyst of his transformation, was becoming a symbol more than a partner. She played her part well. That much was undeniable. They had dinners with Chris's replacement, an eager younger executive named Olivia Tan, who'd made a point to keep things professional, clean, distant. Laura smiled, laughed when appropriate, never too warm, never too cold. Daniel appreciated that. She was learning and watching him. Their marriage was no longer about love. It was about optics. In the office, Daniel had become a force, respected, mysterious, admired with a tinge of fear. People noticed how he moved through the halls now. Calm, precise, like he knew something they didn't because he did. His performance was impeccable, his numbers stellar. But it was the subtlety of his influence that truly mattered. He didn't raise his voice in meetings, he asked questions that made others second-guess. He didn't take credit, he made sure others gave it to him. And every win was carefully staged, every loss traced to someone else. One Friday, near the end of Q3, Daniel received a call from a number he didn't recognize. It was a man named Roger Delaney, a board liaison. The kind of name that didn't show up often, but when it did, you listened. "I've been reviewing your trajectory," Roger said. "You've done more in 2 years than most do in 10. "Thank you, sir. I'd like to meet over lunch next week." The implication was clear. The higher-ups were watching. And that meant new opportunities or new threats. Laura noticed the shift immediately. She was intuitive, sharp in the way women learn to be when navigating a world not designed for them. One night she turned to him in bed, her voice low and curious. "You're different lately." "How so?" "Like, you're already 10 steps ahead of wherever we are. Like you're playing chess and I don't even see the board anymore." He didn't deny it. Just smiled and traced a fingertip along her collarbone. "Maybe I am," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was an invitation to adapt or get left behind. And Laura tried. She really did. She started volunteering at events the firm sponsored. Charity galas, fundraisers, political mixers. She was charming, beautiful, well-spoken. People asked if she was a model or a lawyer or some kind of lobbyist. She let the ambiguity linger. Daniel encouraged it. At one such event, a senator's aide handed Daniel a business card with a handwritten note on the back. "She's quite the asset." He kept it in his wallet like a trophy. But assets, like stocks, fluctuate. The cracks began to reappear, not as betrayal this time but as entropy. Laura grew restless. She started asking questions she hadn't asked in years. "Do you still love me? What are we doing? Are we okay?" Daniel answered all of them politely, like a man giving a press conference, not speaking to his wife. Because in truth he didn't know anymore. He respected her. He appreciated her utility. But love, that was something he remembered like an old song he hadn't heard in years. Familiar but irrelevant. And Laura sensed it. One night after a gala where she'd worn a green silk dress and dazzled half the room, she came home, kicked off her heels and sat silently in their dark kitchen. Daniel poured them both scotch, but she didn't touch hers. Finally she said, "Would you care if I left?" The question hung in the air like gunpowder. Daniel didn't answer right away. He watched her, barefoot, radiant, tired. And for a moment he remembered the first time he saw her in that yellow sundress on a subway platform, smiling at a child who wasn't hers. "I'd care," he said. "But I wouldn't stop you." She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She didn't leave that night or the next, but the dynamic had shifted again. The silence between them was no longer poisonous. It was strategic. Like enemies who shared a foxhole. And so the game evolved. At work, Daniel's influence ballooned. Roger Delaney became a regular presence, dropping into his office just to check in, inviting him to exclusive briefings, referring to him in front of others as one of the sharpest minds we've got. At home, Laura played hostess, confidant, mirror. She stopped asking about love. Stopped pretending to crave it. Their conversations became tactical. Who would be at what party, what outfit made the right impression, which introductions were worth pursuing. She even coached him on which board wives were quietly influential, who pulled strings, who whispered in the ears of senators and CEOs. "You should talk to Cynthia Voss," she said one evening, swirling her wine. "Her husband's just the figurehead. She's the one making the real decisions." Daniel took note. The transformation was complete. But then came the anomaly. Her name was Harper. She was young, fresh out of Harvard with a resume that shimmered with potential. Daniel noticed her not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she didn't flinch around him. Didn't play the game the way others did. She challenged him, made eye contact that didn't tremble. And more importantly, she was smart. At first he kept his distance, he was careful. But Harper had a gravitational pull. Not of seduction but of clarity. She reminded him of something before all of this. Before Chris, before Laura's betrayals, before power became his currency. She reminded him of idealism. They worked late together one night. Quarterly projections, a client with a shifting portfolio. She laughed at something he said, and for a brief second it wasn't about power or strategy or perception, it was just real. "Why are you here?" she asked him suddenly. "You don't need this job anymore. You could be anywhere. Doing anything." Daniel paused. And for the first time in years he said something unguarded. "Because I forgot how to want anything else." She tilted her head. "That's a sad answer." He smiled but didn't disagree. Laura noticed Harper's name showing up more. In calendar invites and project memos. She didn't accuse him. Didn't ask questions. She just adjusted. Started wearing bolder lipstick. Joined him at the office more. Took sudden interest in mentoring younger women at Barclay and Hume. And Daniel watched it all, quietly amused. A triangle forming again, but this time with different stakes. Because Harper wasn't a pawn. She wasn't playing the game. She was a variable Daniel hadn't accounted for. And for the first time in years he felt uncertain. Which strangely made him feel alive.